Garchet's short film, The Mass of Men, has a conventional story with a lot of subtext. The plot of a man's routine trip to a job centre is reimagined to convey a message about society and the problems of having a divide between the working class and the elite, while also using real-life events as inspiration for the events of the narrative. Today, I'd like to propose a critical analysis of theme and characterisation in the short film form, using The Mass of Men as a case study. Before I start my analysis of the film, I'd like to give a brief synopsis. The film opens with footage taken from a CCTV camera of somebody dubiously tampering with a computer before incriminatingly running off. No context is given. We then cut to a busy street and meet our everyman protagonist Richard Burke, who's in a rush to a meeting with his support worker. He enters the job centre in time for his meeting and then moves on to meet Kate. He apologises for being 3 minutes late. To his surprise, she orders him to sign a form for being late that revokes 2 weeks of his job seeker's allowance. After a tense conversation, he reluctantly signs the form, right before a mysterious man enters and attacks Kate with a nail gun. Richard goes to flee, but then turns back to destroy any evidence of his lateness. This action troubles Richard, as the final scene sees him sit alone at a bus stop, fingers in his ears, trying to block out the horrific event as the film cuts to black. In their book Writing the Short Film, Patricia Cooper and Ken Danziger state the short screenplay, much like the short story, works best when its plot is uncomplicated, when we are given a glimpse of someone at a particular, very likely pivotal moment in his or her lives. One of The Mass of Men's defining features is its exploration of political ideology while maintaining its straightforward plot of a man trying to get his job allowance. This extra layer of political subtext is what makes the film intriguing. To quote Johannes Rees, he says, "The problem that my short film students faced was one of avoiding predictability, the solution to which was low communicativeness in the narration." In Garchow's words, The Mass of Men is a revenge film with a political theme.
Had already a pitch somehow of a revenge thing in a job center. Such a political theme that it's very important not to have cliché characters.
Which is undoubtedly noticeable in its presentation of class divide, illustrated by the two main characters. We have Richard, the impoverished everyman who represents the lower class, and we have Kate, the authoritarian support worker who represents the higher class. Applying this analogy to the film begins to uncover a message Garchote is trying to convey.
This is a joke. That's all this is.
Here Richard is angry that his honesty about being 3 minutes late has cost him 2 weeks of his allowance, despite Kate not even noticing his lateness. Here we can infer that the poorest of society are the ones being abused by the rich, as they directly hold all the power. When asked about the representation of the attacker, Garchote replied saying,
The idea was that this person is actually Richard, but in 5 years' time maybe, or maybe even in a year's time.
This point suggests that the attacker represents an idea or group as opposed to an individual, supported by the cinematography that chooses not to highlight his face. Orange also links both Richard and the attacker together, as it is the colour of both their primary objects. Richard Raskin highlights the importance of objects, saying, "In the best short films, there is dynamic interplay of character and object, of subjectivity and physicality." For Richard, his orange bag characterises him by also being informal and cheap. Edgar Allan Poe says in his work The Philosophy of Composition that brevity must be in direct ratio of the intensity of the intended effect. Garchote's film balances Poe's philosophy through representation. The story doesn't need political commentary to be applied to understand the film's narrative. In other words, the characters have been fleshed out and consistently written.
How come that people don't fear consequences, feel that they have nothing else to lose?
The time of the film's release, 2012, was a time of large civil unrest in the UK. The previous year had seen some of the worst city riots of recent memory. Garchett wanted to explore these riots in a different way to how mass media had depicted them, drawing multiple comparisons narratively and thematically.
We wanted to reflect on that, what makes people suddenly become violent.
The London riot started in Tottenham on the 6th of August 2011 and was sparked by the police killing of Mark Duggan, a black Londoner who was suspected of carrying a firearm. no weapon was found on him. The riots took place every night for 3 days, spreading to other cities such as Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham. By this point, the protest over Mark Duggan had faded and became an excuse for violence against the government. Prime Minister David Cameron condemned all the violence and gave emergency power to the Metropolitan Police to quash the rioters. On the 10th of August 2011, 16,000 police officers were deployed into London and no riots took place. The Mass of Men mimics the riots through visuals and perception. The decision to film the opening through a CCTV camera was done to mimic the way most people saw the London riots, as well as informing the audience that this film is not a glorified cinematic experience. The camera's perspective is an observational one, situated in a place where you cannot understand Richard's actions.
We wanted to put the audience in the situation where they see something that they might judge.
Further imagery mimicking the riots follows, as crowded streets are juxtaposed with desolate urban areas, similar to how the once populated streets during the riots were deserted due to the devastation the rioters had caused. The composition of shots is intentionally misaligned, like something is out of place, adding to the sense of uneasiness. We can also compare the riots with the political commentary I previously spoke about, as the class divide was one of the primary reasons as to why rioters were so discontent with society. The following moment sums up arguably the main reason for the riots spreading across the country.
And you behave as if your actions do not have any consequences.
Can I say something?
No.
In this verbal exchange, Richard, our representation of the lower class, attempts to speak up but is immediately shut down by Kate, our representation of the higher class. Compare this with a statement given by Marcus Knox Hook, a friend of Mark Duggan who partook in the riots.
The riots is the language of the unheard, you get me? So I believe people in higher places heard that voice.
What Marcus is suggesting here is that the riots were the only way he knew to get the upper classes to listen. He's by extent similar to how Garchett described the attacker. He'd moved on to the next step. These moments of dialogue also serve to create empathy for Richard, and as Johannes Rees says, the strongest way to engage the spectator is by appealing to our general concern for other people. The audience needs to sympathise with Richard, so we understand why he destroys the evidence later in the film. The Mass of Men proved very popular at film festivals, and it's easy to see why. Its interpretation of modern issues draws much inspiration from the British social realism films of recent, such as Ken Loach's feature film I, Daniel Blake. Creating his film in the short form increased its accessibility at festivals with the low budget it had.
But in terms of filmmaking, it's actually good to have like limitations because it really makes you think better. How can I do it much better in a more effective way?
How Garchett deviates from the genre is by taking the themes and reactions to modern society and applying them to his filmmaking, as opposed to applying them directly to his films, presenting issues such as the class divide or the riots in a way the audience isn't as familiar with. To quote Edgar Allan Poe again from The Philosophy of Composition, two things are invariably required. First, some amount of complexity, or more properly, adaptation, and secondly, some amount of suggestiveness, some undercurrent, however indefinite of meaning. Poe's quote can be used as a great analogy for the Mass of Men, adaptation of topical events, and suggestiveness through its characters and dialogue.